some additional questions for you. In your office, do you have books that you would willingly offer to patients free of charge?
Yes.
Are you able to view external information in this case, such as websites, news broadcasts, or any other medium?
I have assiduously avoided any contact with the media.
Did Jodi tell you that she had purchased a gun in July of 2008 intending to kill herself?
No.
Did she tell you about a plan to kill herself with a razor in jail?
No.
What is the difference between covering up and creating an alternative reality?
Covering up is a voluntary action. It's creating an alibi for yourself. The alternative reality is a psychological process known as a defense mechanism, and it occurs through subconscious forces. The individual who is so afflicted by that oftentimes is not even aware of the depth of their distortion, of their cognitive distortion.
Follow up, Ms. Wilmot.
Doctor, with regard to the defense mechanism that you
Yes.
just talked about, the defense mechanism, is that's part of creating an alternate reality?
Yes.
And when somebody creates an alternative reality, does that help them to not have to deal with what the reality is?
Correct. It insulates them from the feelings associated with the worst part of the trauma.
Okay. And when this happens, when our minds use this as a defense mechanism to avoid thinking about what really happened, is there often associated with that acute stress?
Yes.
How is that associated?
Well, it's the stress that's driving the distortion, the creation of the distortion. Once the stress is removed, very often there's no need for the distortion any longer, and the client is better able to face reality.
Okay, so saying that, if the stress is removed, let's talk about specifically with Jodi, then if the stress of June 4th of 2008 is removed on June 5th, then why is there this defense mechanism occurring when she speaks to Detective Flores in the beginning, or when she's sending an email to Travis?
Well, the stress isn't gone just because the next day occurs.
Okay.
She hasn't dealt with it. She hasn't processed that. There are still gaps in her memory as to what happened. But the fact remains that as long as a person is in conflict and is dealing with such repressed feelings, the possibility of this alternative reality developing does exist. In its most extreme form, it would take the form of a dissociative identity disorder, but that was not the case here, but that's the best example that I can give.
Okay, so you said as long as the person is still in conflict.
The person is in conflict, the person is still experiencing distress, the person is still experiencing the physiological effects of stress. Yes, it would very likely sustain that defense mechanism.
Okay, and so is that something, would you consider Jodi still being in conflict when she's not able to deal with the fact of what happened on June 4th? Is that the kind of conflict you're talking about?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so can somebody be in that type of conflict then until the point of even years?
Oh, it can happen, yes, it certainly can happen.
All right, and when Jodi eventually, bless you, when Jodi eventually came out of this conflict and was able to actually tell you and tell her attorney what happened on June 4th of 2008, how did she feel?
Objection. Characterizing, actually.
Sustained.
When she told you what she says actually happened on June 4th, and the times after that, how did she feel about being able to release that information finally?
Same objection, actually.
Approach, please.
When Jodi talked to you about what she says actually happened on June 4th of 2008, and times after that, did How did she feel about being able to release that information?
She told me that she felt as if a tremendous pressure, a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders.
And is that further evidence or is that further support for you of a defense mechanism versus covering up?
Yes.
When you were speaking to her about, whenever she would talk to you about the thoughts of killing herself, okay, that's what we're going to talk about for a second. If she would have given you a plan that she actually had a plan to do, what would you have done with that information?
Well, if a client gives you a plan for suicide, then you must take immediate steps. And depending upon the circumstances, you would contact the appropriate individuals. That could be, if they're at large, it could be a family member, it could be their doctor, it could be an emergency suicide line. In case of the jail, had that occurred, I would have contacted the jail authorities, the medical department, and alerted them to this possibility, as well as her attorney.
And if she would have talked to you about the fact that she did actually have a plan to kill herself and was going to use a razor and went so far as actually trying to cut herself so that it was something that she did do, if she had told you that, is that something then that you would have had to have been on alert for with the jail?
Absolutely.
And when the jail goes on alert that somebody, an inmate, might actually be might actually try to commit suicide, do you have knowledge as to what the jail is going to do with that person?
I do.
What do they do?
Well, they put the person on suicide watch, where they're monitored every few minutes. They would have a consult with the psychiatrist. Medication evaluation would be done, possibly placing the individual on antidepressant medication, although antidepressant medication doesn't begin working immediately, but at least it would be initiated. And mostly they would be very closely observed and probably placed in isolation.
All right, and so when you talk about being closely observed, that means they lose any semblance of privacy that they might have.
That is
right?
correct.
And when you talk about being in isolation, that means they lose any type of social interaction.
Protection lead.
Sustained.
Do they lose any type of social interaction when somebody is placed in isolation?
They have no social interaction.
Okay. And when somebody is placed for suicide watch, do they also take everything away from them?
The person is, yes, everything is taken away from the individual, sometimes in extreme cases even their clothing, although I don't know that that would be the case here, but nonetheless, everything that is potentially a risk is taken away, so you're really isolated.
So when you talk about that in some cases they'll take their clothing away because potentially they can strangle themselves, right?
That's correct. They can hang themselves with their clothing.
And so hang themselves. And so that's why they would take their clothing away.
That's right.
In your experience with what you've seen happen to people who have any type of a report of a plan of suicide, is it somewhat humiliating for the person?
Objection, to be on the scope of the question.
Sustained.
Judge, may we approach?
You may proceed.
So So if there's any report of suicide, the jail takes it seriously. Is that what you're
Oh,
saying?
very seriously, yes, they do a good job.
And what they do to somebody after that report can be dehumanizing.
Objection, meeting beyond the scope of the question.
Overruled, you may answer.
The consequences can be somewhat dire for the individual, as they are always suspect of engaging in potential suicide behavior again. There may be changes to their living arrangements. Sometimes, I know of cases, again, in the men's jail, I don't know so much about the women's jail, but where they're placed in isolation after that. So the outcome is not predictable.
All right. And you said you were asked the question about when patients come to see you in your office, if you've ever given them books.
Oh, yes.
And is that something that you do?
Well, that's just the way that I did my work. I would buy a carton of books that I felt were appropriate, and especially in cases where individuals couldn't afford to buy the book, I would give it to them to help them get started in their self-help aspect of their therapy. And similarly, when I did evaluations for people, because I could not serve as a therapist, I would sometimes give them a self-help book if I felt it would be useful for them. But that would be just something that I did in my practice.
All right. So people who come to see you in your office, you said that you would give them a self-help book and that would be part of therapy?
If they came to me for therapy, it could be, yes.
Okay. And if they came to you for therapy, is that something that then you would follow up with them during their therapeutic sessions?
Oh, absolutely. And we would use the book perhaps as a guideline for some of the therapeutic interventions. They would have homework assignments based upon books and workbooks. There are a lot of books, not just one. And they would be given homework assignments that sometimes were key to the book and sometimes not key to the book.
Okay. And then with evaluations that you're doing where you're not doing therapy, did you also give books to people who you were doing evaluations for?
On occasion, if I felt it might be helpful to them.
All right. And did you ever follow up with those people when it's an evaluative
Never.
process? Okay. All right. Thank you. Nothing further, Judge.
Martinez, follow up.
Sir, did you gain some knowledge from some other area since our cross-examination? Did you? In the area involving the jail?
Did I gain some knowledge?
Yes, did you go out and do some research?
No.
Well, do you remember we were talking about the book and your gift of the book to the defendant? Do you remember that?
Yes.
And do you remember that you blurted out during cross-examination, well, she was suicidal? Do you remember saying that?
Objection is characterized as testimony.
Overruled.
I didn't say she was suicidal.
Didn't you say that she wanted to commit suicide?
She said that she did not plan to be around for the duration of this process.
Are you saying, sir, that you didn't use the word suicide when we were talking about the book? Yes or no?
I don't recall. I may have, but I don't recall.
Yeah. And if the record reflects that you did use the word suicide, sir, would you have any reason to doubt that?
Objection argumentative.
Overruled.
No.
So if you use the word suicide with regard to the issue involving the book, do you remember that the prosecutor then followed up and said to you, well, did you report it to any of the officers in the Maricopa County jail system? Do you remember me asking that?
I do.
And do you remember that you told me back then, well, I don't know anybody to report it to?
Objection, Judge. Can we also have the prosecutor not yell at the
I'm going to object to the speaking objection. She can.
Sustained to the speaking objection. If you wish to approach, you may.
Okay, then can we approach?
Did you tell us at that time, well, I don't know who reported to at the jail? Do you remember saying that?
At the Durango jail, I did not know who to report it to, and there was no need for me to report it because there was no plan. However, had there been a plan, I would have found out who to report it to.
Bottom line is you told us that you didn't know who to report it to at the Durango jail, right?
I've never had to report it there.
I'm not asking you about that. Isn't it true whether or not you've had to report it? You came in just now and you started to tell us all the procedures involving how to report a suicide at the Maricopa County Jail, didn't you?
At the male jails, yes, because I've had experience with that.
And I'm not asking you about that because you weren't asked about the male jails in the follow-up, were you?
Yes.
You were asked about Miss Arias. Don't you remember her asking you that?
Yes,
She wasn't asking you about the male jails, was she?
but I used that as an example. I qualified my answer.
You didn't say that.
Okay, I thought I did.
Objection, Judge, this characterizes this testimony.
Overruled. You may answer.
You didn't say that, did you?
I'd have to see the transcript.
So, with regard to this issue then, are you saying that you lack the knowledge to know at the Maricopa County Jail when it involves a female as to who you reported to? Is it yes or no?
I don't know the specific person. I know what procedures to follow, but I've never had to do it there. So I would have had to find out who was the proper person to report this to.
At the Durango Jail,
At
right?
the Durango jail.
Actually, there's a problem with that because the defendant stays at the Estrella Jail, doesn't she?
Well, then it's the Australia jail.
Well, no, it's not just Isn't it true?
Sustained.
Isn't it true, sir, that the Maricopa County jail system only houses female inmates at the Estrella Jail?
Right, which is on Durango Street, so I'm sorry I got it confused.
Did I ask you where it was?
No, but I'm explaining my answer.
Right, no, you said that it was at the Durango Jail, right?
Excuse me, I meant the Australia jail on Durango.
There is also a Durango Jail, though, isn't there?
That's correct.
And so you knew that, right?
Well, of course I know that.
Beyond the scope.
Overruled.
And so now you know, when you were asked about it in terms of the suicide issue, you now know that, or you're now telling us, or told us before, that you would go to certain personnel at the Maricopa County Jail, yes or no, if the defendant had indicated true suicide, right?
Yes.
Now, sir, the other thing that you were asked about was about the books that you may or may not give to people, correct?
Correct.
At your office. Those books that you indicated are self-help books, right?
Correct.
By definition, self-help books involve treatment, correct?
No, they involve self-help.
And self-help is not to better the person?
Well, it may be to better the person, but they have to engage in the effort to help themselves. They don't have any external help from me if I'm not their therapist.
That's not, let's do it this way, it's not for the purpose of assessment, those self-help books, are they?
Not for the purpose of assessment, no.
And with regard to this issue about covering up and creating an alternative reality, the bottom line in this case, not the bottom line, covering up involves not telling the truth, correct?
Yes.
And creating an alternative reality, by your definition, also indicates not telling the truth, right?
Well, not telling the truth to me implies that the person has voluntary control over the story they're telling.
And I know that you want to say that, but
Objection. Argumentative.
Sustained.
yes or no, isn't it true that creating an alternative reality is talking about something that's not truthful? Yes or no?
Yes.
I don't have anything else.
All right, Dr. Samuels, you may step down. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask that you go back to the jury room for approximately 5 minutes, and the next witness will be in the courtroom to testify. Please remember the admonition.
Please stand for the jury.
Dr. Samuels, you may step down. We are in recess for 5 minutes.
It's permanently released, things that he owns. Do you want me to? I don't
Why don't
know
you
that it needs
approach?
to necessarily be on the record.
Approach, please. the jury.
Please stand for the jury.
Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. The defense may call the next witness.
Judge, defense calls Ms. Alice LaViolette.
Please come forward right up here to be sworn. Right up here.
Raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please walk right around here and have a seat.
Did you want some water? If you want to, you can pour some now.
Thank you.
Maybe the other cup, though.
What's that?
A clean cup.
Oh, a clean cup. Oh, all right. Never mind. All right.
Just gonna do the same thing. All right, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Could you tell us your name, please?
My name is Alice LaViolette.
And Miss LaViolette, what do you do for a living?
I'm a psychotherapist. I do consulting and training, and I do expert witness occasionally.
Okay. And so, psychotherapy in what?
Psychotherapy, I have a private practice,
Okay.
and I have a specialty in domestic violence. I conduct 2 groups a week for men who perpetrate domestic violence, and I have a broad-based private practice where I do marriage counseling. I also do work with individuals. I work with adults. I work with battered women. I work with adult survivors of childhood abuse. And then I do a broad-based private practice with a variety of issues.
Okay. Let's talk about your education. So what I want to know is what qualifies you to do this type of work. So can we talk about your education for a second?
Yes, I went for 2 years here in Arizona at Glendale Community College. The first year at the campus that we used to call Reed Mullin Ford University, because it was right next to Reed Mullin Ford, and then the actual campus was sort of the campus that's there now was built for the second year. And I went to become a teacher. I got interested in psychology and then went over to Cal State Long Beach and did my bachelor's degree in clinical psychology. About 8 years later, I went back and did my master's degree in community clinical psychology, and then sat for the licensing exam. I had to do 3,000 clinical hours that were supervised, and then I sat for the licensing exam and became licensed in the state of California.
All right. So let's talk about your undergraduate degree first. So you said you finished up at Cal State North Beach?
Cal State Long Beach.
Long Beach.
Uh-huh.
I didn't go there. So, all right. So you finished up, is that where you get your bachelor's?
That's where I got my bachelor's.
And you were talking about becoming interested in psychology?
Yes.
Okay. And so what is your bachelor's in?
My bachelor's is in clinical psychology, and my master's is in community clinical psychology.
Okay. What's the difference between a bachelor's and a master's degree?
About 2 years.
Okay.
I completed my master's in 2 years. It can sometimes take 3, but I actually did it in about 1.5 to 2 years.
All right. And your master's, you said, is in community clinical psychology?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Community clinical psychology is a program at Cal State Long Beach that was kind of unique. You were interviewed by faculty and students who had been through the program, and you you had to pass, well, actually, they had to select from the applicants 12 people who would be part of this program. And back at the time, the reason I wanted to do this program was because it was hands-on. You actually got to go out in the field and work 20 hours a week doing field work, and that's what I wanted to do.
When you say field work, what does that mean?
You could pick a practicum, a place to work that had to be approved by your department. And so at that time, I did 10 hours in a community facility, a community like neighborhood kind of facility, where I was doing tutoring and registering voters and that sort of thing. And then I did 10 hours a week in the battered women's shelter, which I didn't really know anything about, and was wanting to work in some form of impacting violence against women, since I had known people who had been raped and sexually assaulted. And so I was going to work with sexual assault, and one of my friends was volunteering at the shelter and told me that it was a very interesting place to work, and it was a very new field. So I decided that I would apply there, and I volunteered there 10 hours a week.
When you volunteer, when you're working on your master's and in that particular community clinical psychology, and you're volunteering at a battered women's shelter, what is it that you're doing there?
Well, you're doing a lot of different things. I worked on the hotline. I was trained to work on the hotline, so I worked on the hotline.
And what's a hotline?
The hotline is a 24-hour crisis line where people can call anonymously, or they can give you their name, and they can tell you, they can talk to you about what's going on in their lives, and your job is to listen to them, sometimes make referrals, sometimes recommend that they come into the shelter, that sort of thing. And in addition to that, I did clerical kinds of work. I did fundraising for the shelter. I did what was called casual counseling with the women, which is you just sat with the women and the kids in the shelter and talked to them or ran a group. I did a self-defense class for them one time because I'd taken one self-defense class and I wasn't very good. But it was fun for the women to be up and moving around and doing physical things. So.
And can we talk timeline? When in the timeline of your life are we talking about? What year is this?
1978. 1978.
1978 is when you started with your master's?
1978 is when I started with my master's. 1980 is when I completed my master's. And I volunteered at the shelter until 1979, and then I was hired in 1979.
Okay. And when you were hired at the shelter in 1979, what were you hired to do?
I was hired to start a program for men who battered their wives. And the reason for that was that we did a little piece of research on women who had been in our shelter. The shelter opened in 1977. And we did a little piece of research to find out what happened to women after they had left the shelter, a year after they left the shelter. And of the women that we could find, over 80% had returned to the person who abused them within the first year after they left. And so our director was very farsighted, and she said, we need to start a program for the men who are in relationship to the women in our shelters so they go back, so the women and children go back to a safer place. And actually, I didn't want to do that. Nobody actually at the shelter wanted to do that, but I needed a paid position. I had 2 children, and I needed a job.
Why did you ultimately take the job then? Well, let me ask you this. Why didn't you want to take the job of starting a men's group?
Because I'd worked with the women and the children, and it was really hard to see what had happened to them, and so I didn't initially want to do that, but I began to do it. I began to develop the program because I liked, program development. And then when I started the work, I really liked the work, and I stayed with it.
And when you talk about working at the shelter and starting to work on this men's group, are you also still going to school with your master's?
Yes, I'm still going to school with my master's.
All right. And to get your master's, are you taking classes as well?
I'm taking classes. I had a graduate seminar that met 3 hours a week and a supervision group that met 3, and then I had taken a lot of my classes prior to actually getting into the program. They could count classes I'd taken between my bachelor's degree and my master's degree.
Okay. And so at the time that you're now working at the shelter and you're working on starting this men's group, is there also something that you have to do to finish up your master's?
Yes, I had to do a thesis. After I completed my classwork, I did a thesis.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
You write basically a research paper, and it's a significant research paper on a topic that your clinical supervisor approves and that is something that would be of interest. And I did mine on perpetrators of domestic violence. And it was one of the early theses on that topic, because at that time I had sort of a corner on the market. I had there were only 2 programs in Los Angeles County that actually dealt with working with folks who perpetrated violence. And so I had clients who volunteered to participate in that study.
Okay, and when you talk about clients, are you talking about the men, the perpetrators?
Yes, the men who were in my group.
Okay, and that's the group that you created.
Yes.
What was the purpose of that group?
The purpose of that group was to teach people skills and maybe help them to work on issues that would enable them to be more effective parents, to be more effective partners in their relationships. And at the time, I hadn't had much counseling experience. And so I sort of based my group on a healthy family. What would a healthy family look like? And I talked to the women at the shelter because at that time I think there were 3 groups around the country that were doing this work. And I wrote to all of those groups and got information about what they were doing. And they were all doing work at about 6 to 12 weeks. They were doing short-term work. And I talked to the women in the shelter. And what was consistent from those women was that the men they were involved with had grown up in abusive families and needed help, that they needed to be, to have work on trauma issues. And so we created the group to deal also with some of those trauma issues.
And so this group that you created, that you worked with, was it just men who would be in this group?
Yes, in the state of California now, you have to have same-sex groups. At that time, you didn't, but we didn't have any referrals from women at that time.
Okay. And so how long did you keep working with this particular group? Well, you received your master's in 1980, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. When you receive your master's, let me back up a second. When you receive your master's, you said you have to write a thesis.
Yes.
Is that right? Do you have to do anything with that thesis?
You have to have it approved, and you have to sit for orals. So you sit with a group that questions you on your thesis and has to approve your thesis and feel that it's worthy of, if it's to be published. I don't believe mine was published. I think parts of it might have been used, but I never pursued publishing my thesis. I was just happy to get through with it, actually.
All right. So once you receive your master's, that was, you said, in 1980?
Yes.
Okay. And then are you still then at the shelter working in the men's group?
I'm still at the shelter, and I'm working with the men's group, but I'm also doing volunteer recruiting and training, and I'm doing all the community education for the group. So, for instance, I worked with the probation officers locally, and we set up the first 8-hour training program for probation officers on domestic violence in LA County, and then went around the state. And I worked with 2 probation officers on that. I did training for mental health. Initially, really, in 1979, the only people that kind of wanted training were church groups. And I went to United Methodist Women, I remember, were one of the first groups that supported the shelter. And I would go to speak to their church women's groups. I went to speak to the Seroptimist. I went to speak to the Rotary. I went to speak to mental health agencies. So anybody actually who wanted to hear about it. And by the way, at conferences, we would have maybe 3 people in a workshop. People really didn't want to hear too much about it then.
Well, I was going to ask you, in the late 70s when this is occurring, was domestic violence something that was wide known?
No, it wasn't. There were very few shelters. Shelters began to open in the late 70s and early 80s in the United States.
And you said you were one of 3 groups in the U.S. who had a men's group? Is that right?
There were 3 other programs that were outside groups. There was one program in Washington State that was at a veterans hospital, and they had a residential program there that Ann Ganley did.
I'm sorry, that who?
Ann Ganley.
Okay. Is that somebody who's involved in domestic violence, battered women? Or?
Yes, she's involved with battered women, but also involved in doing programs for the men.
Okay. And so when you're doing how did you feel working with these men?
I guess that I felt I felt hesitant at first, but I quickly saw that they were in pain and that they, for some of them, really wanted to change. Some of them didn't. They just wanted to get their partners back. And so the men that I worked with who continued to stay in group because they had an option back then about staying in group really seemed to want to change. And I was excited about that. I thought that was terrific. And I wanted to be part of that process. And by the way, I worked with a male co-facilitator. We wanted to set it up to look like, as much a family as we could. And so I thought having a male-female team would be a good way to go with that. And having that power dynamic where you see respectful interaction between a man and a woman would be good role modeling in that group. So we did a lot of that. And I worked with him for 28 years until he retired.
Your
My
co-part on that?
co-facilitator, yeah.
Did any of these men you had started working with just the women in 1978, is that right?
Right.
Did any of these men ever frighten you when you started working with the perpetrators?
Objection, relevance.
Goes to her expertise, Judge.
Overall. Occasionally. I have been frightened probably 3 or 4 times in my career. If I was frightened very much, I wouldn't keep doing it because it would be too frightening. So there were several times where I really worried. One time with a guy that was a gangbanger who was someone who had murdered people.
And when you talk about the 3 or 4 times, how many men have you counseled throughout your career? Ballpark.
Well, probably a couple of thousand, but I'm not sure. There maybe less than that. I've done two groups a week for 34 years, and I've had normally not more than 12 people in a group, usually somewhere between 8 and 10 people in a group. And the groups change so that it's an open-ended group and people can come in at different times during the period of doing that group.
All right, so from going from the first men's group, what kind of therapy do you do now?
I do very broad-based therapy. I've worked with couples, high-conflict couples, people who need anger management. I work with adult survivors of childhood abuse. I continue to do that. I work with battered women. I continue to do that. I've worked with a few men who have been abused as well. I continue to do the groups, and I work with adolescents. And occasionally I'm working with parents on parenting issues.
And when you're doing this work, do you work always with groups, or do you sometimes work with just an individual?
I work with individuals. I work with couples. I work with, I haven't worked with large families, but I've worked with, like I'm working with a grandmother and her granddaughter now, and who has custody of her granddaughter and that kind of thing.
All right. So after you, how long did you stay working at the shelter with the men's group?
I worked at the shelter from 1978 till 1984.
Okay. And all that time from 79 to 84, was that where you were working with the men's group?
I worked with the men's group from 79 to 84, but I also worked with the women, and I also did community education, and I also recruited volunteers and trained them.
Okay, so you were doing a myriad of things.
Yes, I was.
All right, and in 1984, what did you move to?
In 1984, the funding collapsed for the shelter, and I needed a job, and I thought that it might be a really good idea to try to start my own business, which was something I'd never actually considered in my life before. And I had 2 children, and so I needed...
Sustained.
Oh,
Did you start your own practice?
yes, I did. I started my own practice in 1984.
All right, and what kind of practice was that?
It was a psychotherapy practice, but I continued to do training. The probation department hired me for probably, I think I worked for the probation department on and off for about a decade, doing training for probation officers and people in camps for working with domestic violence.
So did you do volunteer work then along with your private practice?
Yes, I continue to do volunteer work.
All right. The volunteer work, did you actually work for the probation department, or was that volunteer work?
No, they paid me to do that.
Oh, okay.
They paid me to do training.
All right.
I volunteered time, talking with the probation department, but when I trained their officers, that was actually a paid position.
Okay. And what did they pay you to do? You said train their officers. Train them to do what?
Train them to identify and work with people who were arrested for domestic violence.
Okay. And what about, and then with your volunteer work, did you do trainings with your volunteer work?
Yes, I continue to do training. I do training for shelters. I've done training for lots of people who requested it. I continue and have done training for churches. A number of churches have had issues where they've talked about domestic violence in their congregations, and they need to have some way to deal with that or to deal with anger, so I've done that. I do training. Most of the volunteer work I do now is training, although I'm on the alumni board at Cal State Long Beach, and so I do. I've reviewed grants for them and done a little bit. We're starting to meet with younger people and do some mentoring. I do that. I am a reviewer. I'm on the editorial board of a peer-reviewed journal, and I do peer reviews, and that's volunteer.
What peer review journal is that?
Journal of Child Custody.
Okay. Do you ever work in child custody issues?
I do. I consult usually with people when there are child custody issues. I have come in and done expert witness or consulting with child custody evaluators or with attorneys in domestic violence cases, and counseled battered women generally, and occasionally also I've worked with fathers who are going through domestic violence issues and working with them.
All right. And all this training that you do at churches and different areas, what kind of training is it? Is it all different kinds of training, or what are you training people to do?
It depends on the group. When I do training at churches, a lot of times it's to explain why battered women stay. It's to look at gender issues with domestic violence. Sometimes there are counselors out of the churches that want training on doing anger management. There are several groups, church groups, where they had a big enough congregation and they had people that wanted to be peer trained to do anger management groups. So I've done that. It really depends on the group and what they want.
Okay.
I've worked in almost every area of domestic violence. I did training on teen dating violence, and that was volunteer in the high schools. And I've spoken in the high schools in California, around in Long Beach and different areas, and done that as a volunteer. And that would be coming out and talking to kids about dating violence, teen dating violence, and what that looks like, and resources that they might have, and that kind of thing.
All right. And besides training, do you do speaking engagements?
Yes.
What kind of speaking engagements do you do?
I speak at conferences. I do keynote addresses. I've spoken for educational groups. I've keynoted for therapy groups, the California Association of Marriage Family Therapists. I keynoted for their conference. I've keynoted for, well, I keynote for the fatherhood. I've keynoted for, or done workshops at the Fatherhood Conference on a parenting curriculum that I helped develop.
What's the Fatherhood Conference?
The Fatherhood Conference is put on by Children's Institute International, and Herschel Swinger, who has passed away, was the founder of that conference. And it's really to encourage fathers to be the best fathers they can be, and for at-risk dads, fathers who've grown up in gangs or fathers who have not been the best fathers, to really improve their fathering. And there are a lot of men who are very interested in that and come to those conferences.
All right. And besides that speaking engagement, have you been asked to speak outside the United States?
Yes, I've spoken in a number of countries. I've spoken in Japan, Israel, New Zealand, Ireland, Canada, and then I've done some work for the State Department of the United States, and those are video conferences. I just did one in Kathmandu, Nepal. I didn't go to Kathmandu, but I did a video conference there, in Cape Verde in Africa, and in Tel Aviv.
And these speaking engagements, what is it that you're asked to speak about, generally speaking?
I'm asked to speak about setting up domestic violence legislation, community organizing around development of battered women's shelters and programs that are more holistic, that address the entire family. For the most part, that's it. They're countries where people are just developing things, although Israel is quite sophisticated. And when I go to these countries, I sometimes speak to the governmental groups on the creation of laws, because I have done some work on legislation as well.
On the what?
On legislation.
Oh, legislation. Okay. And you said you've done work with the Department of the State?
Yes.
And for the U.S. government?
Yes.
What is it that you do?
Those are the video conferences that I've done. I was asked to go to Sri Lanka and Maldives, and I was asked to go to Africa, but there was a very limited window of time, and I couldn't fit it into my schedule, and so I wasn't able to actually travel, so the video conferences were set up.
So when you're speaking to these other countries, is it the U.S. government that is asking you to speak to them?
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Through the State Department and the embassies.
Okay. Okay. And how long has that been going on? Has that been going on through different presidencies?
During George Bush's presidency and Barack Obama's presidency.
All right. What about, you said you did some work with the LA County Probation Department. Have you done any further work with them? Just in terms of talking to probation officers about clients, but I haven't done training for them. I think, I'm trying to remember the last time I keynoted the State Probation Conference, and that's about the last time. I also did a speaking engagement for female probation officers that had a specialized group, and I did training for that group. A specialized group of what?
Just female probation officers.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you ever help to create any programs with the county department, the probation department?
Did I create programs?
Yeah, so like design any type of domestic violence training?
Well, yes. With in 1980 in California, we created a diversion law, and people were diverted from the system and sent to counseling. And so that was where I worked with the diversion officer and the supervisor of the adult probation department to develop the training for officers to be able to deal with this influx of new clients on this new issue.
All right. What about awards? Have you ever received any awards in the area of domestic violence or in that area?
Yes, I've received a number of awards. I've been very fortunate. I just received an award from the shelter that I worked at just this past year. It's called a Champion of Hope Award. I've received a Lifetime Achievement Award. I've received proclamations from the county and the state. And I've received from the Seroptimist and other groups' awards.
Okay. And we've been mentioning California a lot. Is that where you currently live?
I live in California. I've
Okay.
lived in California since I moved there in '67.
All right. And were you originally from Arizona? You said you went to Glendale Community College to begin with?
I moved to Arizona when I was 10. I moved from New Jersey to Arizona. I went to Sunny Slope High School, and I come back from my high school reunions and still have friends back here.
All right. But other than that, your business and everything is in California?
My business is in California, yes.
Okay. And so when you're talking about helping to develop different probation trainings and things like that, that's why we're talking about Los Angeles County?
Yes, and the state of California.
The state
Yes.
of California. Okay. Do you have any published works? Have you published anything in this area?
I have a book called It Could Happen to Anyone, Why Battered Women Stay. It's coming out in its 3rd edition in April. I have articles that I've written for the journal Child Custody, I have a chapter in a book called Domestic Violence Offenders. I have...
Let me ask you, the chapter in the book called Domestic Violence Offenders, what is it that you're writing about?
It's called A View from the Trenches, and it's about, it's sort of a 25-year retrospective. I can't remember. Well, it was 2002, I think it came out. And it was a retrospective on batters intervention programs and looking at what we currently know and what we knew and some of the things we look at to measure success in programs and some of the things we want to have happen in those programs.
Okay. And the book that you said that you wrote about why battered women stay?
Yes.
Is that what it's about?
Yeah, it's about why battered women stay.
All right. And when did you first write that? Do you remember?
The first edition was in 1993, and it became a bestseller for Sage Publications. And so they asked us to write a second edition, which we wrote in 2000. And then they asked us to write a 3rd edition. And my co-author and I are old enough that we don't believe a 4th edition is going to happen.
All right. With regard to that particular book, how is it that you sit down to write a book like that? Is it based on research? What do you do to have that information available to you?
My co-author's a researcher. I was not a researcher. My co-author would bring me piles of research, basically, piles of articles, and I would have to read them and write them up in a way that could be understood. And we use case studies in the book. We made the book something that we hoped that folks could read who were victims and perpetrators of domestic violence as well, but also people who are just interested. It's used as a textbook currently in a number of universities back east. I was just a couple years ago speaking in Hawaii, and somebody from a small island near Sri Lanka came up to me and said that they used the book there. So I have no idea who else using it, but we feel pretty good about it because people have liked it. And we've also, we've had attorneys who have used it in their cases.
Okay. And clearly you're here testifying, so do you do forensic work as well?
Yes, I started doing forensic work in 1984. I was asked by an attorney to explain why a battered woman would kill and why she stayed. My first trial in 1984 was a domestic violence homicide trial. And at that time, the battered women's testimony was not considered. It really wasn't well thought of or well respected. And so I didn't testify in that case. I consulted in that case. But I know that I didn't even know that this was a job. I thought it was a volunteer position. And when she asked me to do it, I said, certainly I'd be happy to do it. And I said, I'm assuming it's a volunteer position. And she said, no, you get paid to do it. And so I was surprised.
All right. And since that time, do you know about how many cases you've worked on forensically?
I've worked on about 60 cases forensically. I don't do a lot of forensic work. I do usually about 2 cases, sometimes 3 cases in a year, depending on whether I'm consulting.
Why don't you do a lot of forensic work?
Because it's very difficult for me sometimes to watch the process.
Objection, relevance.
Sustained.
Do you have your own practice as well?
My private practice?
Yes.
Yes, I do.
So besides coming here to testify, do you also have a private practice that you're running?
I hope so when I get back.
Okay. What types of cases, we're talking about the forensic cases that you've worked on. What types of cases have you worked on?
I've worked on homicide cases. I've worked on a stalking case, a kidnapping case. I've worked on child custody cases. Most of the cases I've done currently are child custody cases.
Let me stop you there. When you talk about child custody cases, is that a criminal case?
No, it's not.
Okay,
It's a family law case.
okay,
So family law cases, I've done 2 civil cases, 1 federal case, 1 post-conviction case.
okay. And of the criminal law cases that you've done, about who retains you? Do you have an idea who you work for more often, the defense or the prosecution?
I've worked for the defense about 16 times, 15 times, something like that. I've worked for the prosecution about 9 times, and I've done some prosecution work that I don't even think I have on my CV, where I've just consulted with the DA's office. I've done 3 consultations for the district attorney in Los Angeles County, and I've just volunteered. I've done that, and I do volunteer mock trial for the district attorney so they can practice with an expert witness, and I do that. I've done that twice now.
So you help the prosecutors in California get experience at cross-examining an expert like yourself?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And do you have a particular criteria that you use before you'll decide to accept a case?
Objection, relevance.
Approach. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take the evening recess at this time. Please be back in the designated area at 10:30 tomorrow morning, 10:30. Please remember the admonition. Have a nice evening. You are excused.
Please stand for the jury.
The record will show the jury has left the courtroom. Counsel, anything else for today?
No, nothing.
We are
No, Your Honor.
recessed. You may step down.